Welcome to the Queer Spirit Podcast. We're your hosts, Nick Venegoni
and TanyaMarck Oviedo. Our Queer Spirit Podcast spotlights queer artists, healers, practitioners, activists, and beings
who share their work and magic with our LGBTQIA, two-spirit, trans, and gender nonconforming communities and the collective. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show today. Our guest today is myself and TanyaMarck. We're doing something a little different today, and we decided that we're just going to have a conversation and do a little bit of interviewing each other so that our listeners can get to know us a little bit better and share a little bit about how we met, how we started this collaboration, some of the behind the scenes stuff that we do with the podcast and also our other projects that we work on. And we might even talk a little bit about friendship and the importance of friendship within the queer community, and maybe some other witchy magic things that we are interested in our lives and our tools and our practices, and go from there. So it's going to be an interesting ride, and we hope that you enjoy it with us.
Yes, amazing. Thank you, Nick. And so listeners, we really wanted to share with you what it's like when Nick and I cultivate connection together. So we want to invite you to ground in with us. And the way that Nick and I ground in twice a week is we do so with vocal toning. And so as we do that, we want to acknowledge the energies of the native lands that we're on, the Tongva, Kich, Chumash, Alone, all of our tools and guides and practices. Taking a moment to connect to our breath. We decided that what felt good today was to honor the sacral chakra and the idea and the energies of feelings and expression and sexuality and connection. And in doing so, we will be honoring the tones of ooh, Ray, and Vom. We also want to give a shout out to our devotional voice teacher, Linda Arnold. Nick and I met through that. So as we ground into these tones, honoring the Sanskrit practices, the bija mantras, and our vowel sounds as they connect to our chakras, which are energy systems in our bodies. So this morning we will model a call and response for you. Yes, I love that queer ending. Thank you for making everything queer.
Why we're here.
It's so great. You know, it's funny. I found, just for our listeners, Nick and I connected on the phone for this prior to, it was our pregame, if you will. And I do want to acknowledge that I felt a bit of nervousness. And isn't it interesting that, you know, we really want to highlight our queer story, our queer connection. And I think the nervousness is coming from more of a place of vulnerability and tenderness that, you know, what is our sharing our story? You know, what brought us here? Why are we doing this podcast and all of that? So
as you mentioned, we met through our vocal music teacher, Linda Arnold, aka Diva Sonic. And, you know, I live in San Francisco and TanyaMarck lives down in Long Beach. And so we might not have met otherwise, but maybe we can share a little bit about what brought us to that group and then eventually brought us to each other.
Oh, yeah, I love that. Oh, that's a good one. Yeah, let's start there. And thank you, Linda. Thank you, Linda, for the devotional voice virtual container, because if it hadn't been for you, Nick and I wouldn't have not met. So, yeah. So what brought me to devotional voice was I was at a point in my own personal healing pathway where I recognized that as a queer person, a young queer person, when I was in high school in the 80s, I went to a Catholic high school that required us to participate in extracurricular activities. And knowing that I'd been a queer being for some, I had a very, decision to make. Did I want to join choir and drama, or, go do something that involved more movement? Because I, was also an athlete. And my own internal homophobia, I was like, well, shit, I can't go join drama and choir because if I do, I'm going to be outed. And so instead I went to become, as I lovingly and laughingly say, a lesbian dyke athlete, which was also, I was kind of like, well, which route are we going to go here? So now fast forward many, many years later in pandemic times, and I was working with one of my teachers, and I said, I had retired from teaching, so I wasn't using my voice as often, and I was sharing with her that I miss using my voice, and we started to talk about other ways to, explore voice. And then it came up singing, and she had asked about singing, and I was like, oh, I've always kept that very private, like in my car, in the shower, but I love it. And so her invite was to explore that. So literally I had gone into meditation, and Spirit sometimes works through IG, and there came a promotion for devotional voice for Linda's class. And actually, to be honest, it was piano first. And so it was something musical. And then through her piano course, online piano coursework, improv piano, I was introduced to her devotional voice. And so I like to say that finding devotional voice for me was also honoring a big part of my queerness, which is I love singing and being in musicality. So that's how I landed there. What about you? How'd you land?
Well, before I answer that, I think you've told me this story a few times before, but it's interesting to me to think about like you in high school and like wanting to do this thing or that thing and like worried which one is going to make you appear more queer.
Right. Yeah.
But I was just thinking, like, as you were sharing that, like, as a non-binary person, like, I can see how, like, there's this part of you where, like, in my mind, I think, well, if, a female identified person does theater, like that's okay in high school, but I can see where like more of a male identified person in high school might appear more queer. Whereas like vice versa, whereas in like sports, like it's not necessarily like, female identified people who do sports in high school are necessarily queer. But if that's where like you're going to find that like queer girls, it's going to be on like soccer and volleyball and.
Or at least those were the stigmas, are like all of those queer stigmas that were attached. And isn't it interesting, because also knowing that I was a two-spirit person way back then, it's interesting because, to be honest with you, it would have been like if I could have, like we didn't have a lot of money. And listen, my mom's language of love was education, and she worked and sacrificed very hard to put my sister and I through, this type of education. So it would have not been okay for me to go back and say, I want to do both. It was awesome that she could pay, because we had to pay for that stuff, right? And it was very costly. So for me, honestly, as a two-spirit person, it would have been and I would have probably loved being in both. And to be honest, there were some of my friends that did both, but they also lived this very hetero cisgendered, we're in this hetero cisgendered lane. So to them, me, internal homophobia was driving. So I was trying to make decisions according to what I thought would, be the most safest. So yeah.
Yeah.
What brought you to devotional voice with Linda?
Well, similar to you, music was also a big part of my life since I was young. My dad is a musical person. He sang in the church choir and, so I grew up singing in choirs in elementary school and then seeing my dad sing, and I took piano lessons as a kid. And then when I was in high school, I did do choir and theater. And I think I didn't worry so much about it outing me. I just was like, well, this is where I feel safe and comfortable, and this is something that I want to do. So that's, whereas like I wouldn't have felt, well, first of all, I didn't have any interest, but I also wouldn't have felt comfortable joining a sports team or anything like that. But yeah, music has been a big part of my life for a long time. And in some ways, I feel like music is one of the most potent ways that I connect to my own spirituality and my spiritual practice. And so to fast forward a bunch of years, couple decades. So during the COVID quarantine, lots of people were offering classes online. And so I just happened to come across a few different teachers who were offering classes in sound healing. And so I first took a couple courses with this woman in the East Bay here in the Bay Area named Laura Insera, who is Sicilian and does a lot of sound healing work. And then after those, I discovered Linda through a series of events, which is kind of a long string, which I won't get into right now, just because it's sort of like this person to this person to this person. But yeah, I found her courses, and I actually started with her music production and sound meditation design work, and that led into the devotional voice. Because I also really missed singing. I really enjoy singing in groups and hadn't for a long time, even before COVID, but especially during COVID when it felt so isolating. It felt good to just be in some kind of community. And that's how I first saw your little picture in the Zoom box.
Well, I love hearing that the younger version of Nick, that you chose choir and theater because it felt good and safe to you. You know what I mean? Like, that's such a beautiful, I'm glad that you were able to navigate and land somewhere in that way. You know what I mean? As a queer person, right? Especially because, finding places to land that are safe are so important in that, in any point in time in life, but sheesh, most certainly back then, because the tools that were available were very lacking back then compared to what we have now. And that I think it's beautiful that that call for community, during pandemic time when we were locked down, I certainly resonate with that too. It was beautiful to be in community space, right? Doing something. Then fast forward into that time, and then I think it was Linda decided she was going to do an in-person offering, right? Way down the line, in a time that was more safer. And that, but you and I think, we kind of had chatted maybe I don't know, was it not really? Or did you just say, hey, I'm coming?
No, not really.
No, yeah. And then you're like, hey, I'm coming to the in-person. So then that was it, right? That's when we that collision, of in-person was at that event. We sang together, right? It was beautiful in the flesh.
Live in the flesh.
Yeah, that was really rad because a lot of the classmates that we had seen, virtually, it was nice, a small intimate group, but it was really beautiful to be in person with one another. Yeah.
Yeah. And then we just vibed and chatted more along the beach after that and started brainstorming right away.
Yeah. It was almost like this very synchronistic collision, of it makes sense. And also just naming, I know in my life that my connections with other queer folks, right, specifically, there were times in my life where I had, I guess, I don't want to label it as gender, but I will say that I've always been drawn to cultivating connection with other gay folks that don't identify as lesbian, right? Specifically lesbian or identify as women. And that there were periods of time where that was actually discouraged, unfortunately, as if there was some type of if you identify as a lesbian, you don't hang out with a gay person. So I also went through this whole mixture of whatever. So it was really beautiful. I think our timing of connection, that we could come together as queer people and be like, hey, I see you and I see you too. And let's hang out, let's chat. And so I'm super grateful. I don't know if I've ever expressed that to you, but thank you for taking that leap, and that we said, yeah, let's connect.
Well, thank you. Yeah. So we talked about connecting and we're like, we should talk about collaborating and doing something together. And so I was already doing semi-regular, the monthly meditations online and that kind of thing. And so I invited you to come facilitate a couple of those. And then I interviewed you on the podcast and we just had a really good, flow. But what I really appreciated was I don't know if I want to call it discipline, but kind of the structure and commitment that you sort of proposed, that we actually made an intention to actually connect, especially since we were not geographically in the same area, to cultivate connection and just talk on the phone once a week on a regular basis to sort of see how we fit and if it made sense to actually move forward with doing something more organized to bring forward in the way that we are now.
Yeah, I appreciate you naming that because I remember feeling, again, honoring, part of the healing path that I was on of, in this COVID time, like really for me personally, I had gone through such a purge of disconnecting from socially a lot of group, a long time groups. And so I was really in this place where I was like, what does it mean to cultivate, genuine, authentic connection? And so to me, feeling comfortable enough to come to you and say, hey, like we do feel this energy, we're seeing each other kind of thing, but also can we take some time to, actually cultivate it? And can we do it on a consistent basis so that we can just see, you know what I mean, without having to, I don't know, for lack of better wording, prematurely ejaculate and explode and start doing all of these things. But let's cultivate connection, let's seed a kind of connection that, and see what happens. And I'm really grateful that we both, for me, I was like, wow, that's quite a leap. I was thinking about that, last night in meditation, thinking like, wow, Nick and I really took a leap with each other. We spend twice a week with each other now in cultivated connection, talking about all things, but mostly we check in with each other. We check in around, the podcast for Saturdays. It's beautiful. It's such an embedded part of my week, you know what I mean? And I think it really speaks to the importance of having queer connections that are intimate, right? And that are their intimate connections and that they can be built over time that do not involve necessarily having romantic sexual things, and the importance of us having queer connection as queer people.
What I was thinking as you were just talking is it's almost like it's kind of like the best of both worlds in terms of like friendship and colleague. It's like we work together, like we're doing something work-ish, I guess. We're creating and collaborating these things together, but then we've developed a friendship. But I think that we had to sort of connect enough intentionally to see if there was at least some kind of basis for some kind of friendship beyond just like, oh, well, I like what you do professionally and like we can create and produce this thing together. But we also have like this friendship that I think is kind of more of the foundation for what it is that we're doing. And also, since this is not, it's what we do is sort of connected to like the work that we do in the world, but it's not like the primary thing. So we're not focused on like, well, how is this going to make money? Right. And one of the things that I really like that you continually bring forward with us in all aspects of your life is, as care as opposed to profit. And I think that that's the thing that we're always focusing on is like, how are we bringing whatever it is that we're offering to the community, to the queer community and the people out there who listen to the podcast or show up for our meditations or whatever it is that we're doing with them centered as opposed to profit.
Yeah, thank you for naming that too. I feel like, the common denominators that kind of showed up for us as we, chose to explore and cultivate connection were care and being of service. And I think too, like, as you said, our foundation is really built on that, like not honoring self-care, honoring community care, and how do we be of service, acknowledging that we both belong to the queer community and a community that's in need of, care and attention in a way that is accessible, I think is the other thing that makes it very, care centered. And so, yeah, it's amazing to me. It's so fun. It's been such a fun journey and continues to be such a fun journey. We're even talking about, now going into the next calendar year, you were so excited, like now we're like, wow, we've learned so much. How can we take what we've learned and continue to cultivate this in a way that is, so that we're there for our community and we're continuing to build our personal, friendship, and that connection is continuing to cultivate. So I think it's a beautiful and it speaks to what it means to go low and slow, if you will, and to check alignment along the way, and so it lights me up. I just get excited about the stuff that we're doing. And, coming up here in our winter season, we get to spend some more in-person time together. And that, it just feels it's cool. It's like exciting, like it's on the calendar, like, yay, but also like, yeah, it's just been amazing. So.
And then I also think it's important to highlight again, going back to what we were talking about before, just like intentionally setting time apart to connect, especially because we don't live in person together, and the way that cultivates friendship. And we've both talked about in our offline conversations about how we continue to try to cultivate friendship and community in our lives. And, we're not old yet.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I know you identify as an elder, and I'm past going into my late 40s here. And also post COVID pandemic and quarantine, there's been a lot of isolation. And both myself and my husband, and then also some clients that I work with, really struggle with how do you cultivate connection and like meet new people and friendships, especially when people's lives get busier, your careers take over, or a pandemic, keeps you separated from people, or especially people who are not interested, especially as we get older, we're not interested in meeting people in bars and clubs anymore. It's like, or people who are sober and don't want to be in those kinds of spaces. And people who, again, I think it's important the way one of my intentions of cultivating the community that we do is for queer people who are spiritual but don't have necessarily a fixed spiritual community like a church that they may have left because they weren't accepted there.
Yeah, that. I mean, it's so many different things, right? So you speak to that, and I also think about the queer people that chose, during the early times in the pandemic to go inward. And so then, and not just queer people, but people in general that, chose to go inward and then come out of it and say, wow, like, what does it mean to cultivate connection? And how do you completely control, alt, delete, and reset, hit a reset on that? And so I love the aspect that you're, shining a light on that about queer spirituality. I think that you and I come together in such a beautiful way that we get to share about our queer spiritual aspects too. And that's so needed, right? Like, because you're right, we don't have necessarily set places, and then we might come from religious backgrounds that unfortunately in a harmful way, we were disconnected from or banned from. And yes, there are those types of structures out there that are open to queer people, but where do we get to talk about the queer witchy magic-y stuff that is outside of that? And the fact that queerness is a culmination of all things. So it's not necessarily just one path. It could be a few different paths. You and I get into tarot sometimes. We talk about breath work. We talk about witchiness. We talk about the lunar cycles. And how beautiful is that we can freely share. And it's not, we don't have necessarily even the same practices. That's what's even more magical, is that we see each other and meet each other where we're at, around like, wow, that's so cool. You teach me so much about, when you start getting into your magic about essences and flower and those, the essences and those studies, my ears perk up, because I love hearing you drop into your witchiness, because it's like, wow, what a beautiful exchange of energy. To me, it lights me up. Sometimes we go way over our phone time because we get so caught up in we're like, woo, witchy, so witchy. But yeah, I love it. I think it's so important. It's such an important part of, cultivating connection too. So,
well, I want to jump on the witchy train with you, but I really want to call back something that you just said, just because I thought it was so funny. A reference when you said control, alt, delete. I was like, wow, that's a throwback to 80s, 90s computer stuff. And I was thinking, does that even work anymore? Can you still do control, alt, delete on a computer? Or does...
Yeah, you can. I'm pretty sure. But you can also internally.
So for any of those of you who were born after 95, you probably don't know about control, alt, delete. But it was a way to restart your computer if it froze.
It's the way I refer to I don't know if I've ever told you that. Control, alt, delete is the way that I refer to one aspect of my pandemic journey, actually. It's part of my story where I say that, it was a big reset for me internally. So, yeah. And having reference being a techie computer scientist person in another lifetime. But yeah, it's kind of, I think it's such a beautiful reference to reset.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. That'd be a good theme for a ritual.
Yes. What a great spell, right?
How do we just stop and reset everything?
Well, I mean, yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, I enjoy our witchiness too. And I like the way that we have an overlap in some of our understandings and our practices. And then there's ways that we have, we bring a lot of different stuff in, that and I really like learning from you and hearing from your perspective, and how your whole life experience brings in a different perspective. And
Yeah, right back at you. I also think for our listeners and for those of you that are joining us for the first time too, Nick and I co-facilitate a queer meditation on the first Saturday of each month. And we spend time looking at the lunar transits. We take a look at what's going on transitly, lunarly, what's going on personally, and we take all of those things into consideration when we curate and start talking about our first Saturday, like what kinds of themes do we want to bring in for the community? What do we see going on? And to me, that lights me up. We get to bring our magic into the, and bring that as the part of the foundation to this beautiful offering that happens on the first Saturday of every month, where it's queer beings coming together to do what? Be in self-care practice together, to be in spiritual practice together. So it really lights me up how our cultivated connection has also been threaded into the service work, that we do for our community.
Yeah. I want to take a quick break to offer you a gift. I work with many queer folks who struggle with self-esteem, self-acceptance, and confidence. And I get it. Growing up queer is no cakewalk. Living in a world filled with homophobia and oppression can take its toll. Having the strength to be your true self can be a challenge. But you can change that. So if you'd like support taking the first few steps, head over to my website and grab the free mini course, The Self-Confident Queer. Just go to queerhealingjourneys.com/confident. This mini course will walk you through 3 simple steps to help you begin to build your self-worth and confidence today. So head over to queerhealingjourneys.com/confident and get the free course today. Okay, now back to the conversation. I mean, just that alone, the creation of that has been really fun and nourishing and exciting. And because, one of the things I appreciate about you, TanyaMarck, is that you have a very disciplined practice and I don't at all. And so, doing that stuff is like, okay, at least I know I have something monthly that I'm doing, if nothing else, right? I do better if I have an accountability buddy, or some external thing sort of holding me accountable. It's hard, to do something for myself just on my own. So I do better in relationship or in community to do those kinds of things and keep myself in check, whether it be my yoga practice or meditation practice or a music practice or whatever that is.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, and I love how, again, it speaks to this idea of cultivating queer connection amongst ourselves. We don't share the same practices. We might have, some common denominators and things that we do, but the point is that we meet each other where we're at, right? And that to me is so important. It's part of, cultivating intimate connection. And I think that what I see happening is that we're even talking about how, the birth of the podcast and how, things have kind of evolved with that our connection kind of weaves into that. And you can see that there's a lot of intention, right, put in meeting people where they're at, right, sharing queer stories about others, their connections, the magic that they share. Like I don't know. It's really cool to me because if you would have said hey, because you two cultivate connection a couple times a week, this is where you're going to land and what's going to happen. I would have been like, oh, wow. I never would have guessed it, so it's been such a beautiful ride. You know what I mean? Queer ride, queer roller coaster of love to really go through this and and it excites me, but also I think the other thing that I think is important, I was sharing that thank you for seeing me in my spiritual practice. I will say that my spiritual practice is something that I lead with that, in a lot of ways. It is a huge part of my life, period. And that just is what lights me up. You know what I mean? And it feels so good. And it feels good to be seen that way and to be met and valued in that aspect. You know what I mean? And so that's really rad, and I appreciate that. And I see you with your magic as well, and the magic that you carry and bring, in using your voice. I always say this, but like Nick, he has a buttery voice, but Nick's like spirit works through Nick's voice. And I say that in the sense that it really, you carry this energetic frequency. I call it buttery, but others may call it something else yummy. But like, it's beautiful to have watched you learn how to share that in community, in queer community with others too. So yeah.
I mean, that means a lot to hear that, because I think especially as a queer person, as a gay man identified person, that, it's something I've been self-conscious of for a long time, like not sounding masculine enough or sounding too gay and that kind of thing. And I think that it can be hard for a lot of gay men, especially, to have the kind of relationship with their voice that where they can feel free and feels good and that kind of thing. And even when I started doing the podcast on my own, I hated listening to it because I hated listening to my voice, But over time, this is like the 6th year now, and I'm just used to it, and it doesn't bother me anymore. But it did. It's hard. It's hard to hear it. So it's hard to.
Well, to me, it's buttery, and I can listen to it, all the time. So happily, and I'm sure that our listeners are also lucky. Like, one of the things we're most excited about is that we're now figuring out how to explore maybe doing some musical things like in person together, right? So we can kind of bring those aspects of our medicine together. And so I'm really excited about that. Because we don't live in the same city, we, plan these little opportunities to do so. So it's exciting to see where that might also lead. I think our dream being that we maybe next year or do some in-person offerings both in the Bay and Long Beach, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because we both have our own musical practices, which, again, just like our spiritual practices, have some overlap and some differences, and doing that together in combination with breath work and meditation can be really powerful. And that's kind of what I feel like our first Saturdays are, like a little mini taste of like something that we could do that I envision would be like a day-long thing for like 3 or 5 hours or something like that, to really drop in deeply and take people on a journey and have some powerful medicine experiences.
And be amongst queers. Yeah, that's our dream. That's definitely something, and I love that, First Saturdays being the seedling of that. And I think our podcast also being this seedling of both of us recognizing where we're at in our life and the importance of highlighting queer stories individually, but also the stories of queer connections, right? And that in a way that doesn't necessarily get highlighted a lot, right? The storytelling of that. And it makes me think of the time we spent with Jason and Crystal, and how that, really in one of our episodes for our listeners, we got to spend time and heard, held space hearing another queer story of two folks that it's just a very beautiful story. And so really thinking of how, we want to really put emphasis on that, moving forward in our seasons, that these are important lights to shine on for many reasons, right? We have tons of legislation and a lot of, there is a lot of reactiveness in all kinds of ways, violence, harm, all shadowy ways in our relation to queer community. And I feel like what you and I have said together is, how can we as queer beings respond in a way, respond and not react to that? And so I feel like the podcast is a beautiful response to that. Like, let's shine a light on our queer stories, our queer connections, and the magic and medicine we share with the world. And then First Saturday says, let's provide a brave space where we can all come and breathe. And, I say we're going to queer the world one breath at a time, like where we can come and be in community and share in that common denominator of spiritual practice. So to me, it just, that's how excited I get, like tongue twisted, because I'm like, I'm so excited, but yeah, I feel like I'm here for it,
Yeah. And I think that connection, intention, friendship, collaboration are all really important. And like you said, having that conversation with Jason and Crystal was really great, to hear how they do it and hear their story about how they met, which was so cute, just meeting in a cafe. And, and quickly want to just call back to some other collaborators that I've had on the show prior to you being here, TanyaMarck. I had the guys from Minority Report who have their own podcasts, and those are, three queer Black men who live all in completely different cities, and scattered throughout the country, and they meet every week and they produce a show every week and they put it out within a matter of days. They are doing, a really great work there. And I've had, who else have I had on? I'm blanking on names. Well, Crystal, I had on initially with their previous collaborator doing the Queer Arts Festival here in San Francisco. And of course, I did not prep for this segment of the show, so I'm pulling all these things out the top of my head. We had Al and Shakti, who are over in England, who do the Queer Spirit Festival, which is not connected to us at all, but we both support each other, and they've only done that a few times because they were doing it every other year, and then they didn't for a long time, and it just happened this last August. So if you're in Europe or you want to go to England, check them out. And maybe I'll do a little playlist of all the collaborators that I've had on the show. But yeah, just hearing different people's stories about how they've met and how they've cultivated connection with each other to collaborate, and how they cultivate and support community in that way.
Yeah, and it just, I don't know, because we're witchy, we can plant these kinds of seeds. Our goal is to get funding for both First Saturdays and our podcast so that we can continue to keep these accessible, and also recognize that as practitioners and facilitators that it is important. The work that we do is also important to be valued. So if we happen to have a listener out there, I'm going to say this, it was coming. If we happen to have listeners out there that would like to find ways, to support, we will definitely put the link in the show notes on how you can support the work that Nick and I share with the collective, because it really does light us up. It's not changing anytime soon. Heck, I'll do it for the next 20 years with you, which, by the way, we had a question from our listener about, something in 20 years from now, which might be a good time to bring up.
Yeah. So we knew we were going to do this show with just the two of us, and I put out there if anyone had any questions for us.
Just the two of us.
And so the question we got was actually from a previous guest who's been on the show twice, Andrew Eli Raymer.
Thank you, Andrew.
He asks us, what's your vision of what queer culture will be like in 20 years? Any thoughts, TanyaMarck?
Yeah, well, the first thing that I saw was, and 20 years from now, queer spirit, we will still be looking amazing in all the ways that we do, but perhaps there'll be I don't know, what do they have when people win, not because we're trying to win anything, but a gold or silver album, maybe we have these queer stars that say 1,000 episodes of, you know what I mean, or 2,000 meditations. That would be amazing. Not that we're trying to win anything, but my hope is that with queer culture, that these types of things are just mainstream, meaning that pronoun usage, queer spaces, places, all of this stuff all of the things that are being done now are now just completely embodied. Would be amazing, would be my dream queer culture, where everyone, period, is seen, heard, and valued for who they are, and honored that way, and with vibes of equanimity and inclusion and equity, all of those, sprinkling all of that energy into it. That queer culture in itself also tender, but I'm going to name it, that queer culture has also done its own healing from its own internal homophobia and things that happen as well, because that is something that continues to happen and I think needs care. That's also what drives you and I to do this stuff too, is that we do experience harm within our own communities, and my hope is in 20 years from now that we are coming from a more care-centric place as a queer culture. What about you? What's your vision?
Yeah, well, I think what you had talked about mentioned, diversity, equity, inclusion, the way that I think about it, and the way, I don't know how other people see it, but I'm sort of feeling it starting to gel a little bit more, is not just queer people, but hopefully most other oppressed groups, people of color, women, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that we are all moving forward together in progress. And, some of us are making quicker strides than others. And then some of us are coming back, and it's kind of like, oh, we can't leave our other siblings behind, even if they're not queer or they're not person of color or they're not female identified or whatever group you belong to bring them forward. And I don't know, 20 years? Hopefully we haven't fallen back any further than we've started to a little bit, but I'm hoping that we progressed and that I have hope, people that I know who work with younger people now, like people who are in high school right now, that they're starting to have a different vision of the future, not only socially, but also environmentally, because that's like the thing we need to be worrying about as well and thinking about and working on. I'm cautiously optimistic that things, in 20 years, that things will feel a lot better and there will be a little bit more cohesion and solidarity and less fragmenting socially and fighting among, the groups and within the groups, as you were saying, that we can move forward together and say, hey, we all agree that these are some basic things that everyone needs to have, whether it be equal rights or clean water or housing or food, etc. Right?
Yeah, it also makes me think of, and Andrew, thank you for asking this, because I do think it's important for us to plant these types of seeds of what does this look like 20 years from now, is that we continue to find ways to honor the wisdom of our elder queers and queer ancestors, and that continues. That light is so important to shine a light on, the stories, and to acknowledge the sacrifices and endurances and things that elder queer people have done. I think is going to always be really important to continue to shine a light on, because it is what they are the reason that we're here. When I think about what about prior to podcasts? We didn't grow up with podcasts, by the way. We did grow up with radio shows, but there weren't a ton of queer ones, right? Once in a while you might find something a little underground, if you were lucky. But now, when I think about it, all these beautiful queer queer people have much more access. My hope is, right, because I don't want to sound like I'm coming from privilege either. My hope is that because we have all these ways in which queer people can express themselves and share their stories, that they are archived and continued to be honored in a way that's so important that we don't forget where we came from, right? And that we find ways to continue to honor that, because that's such a huge part of moving forward, right? Is remembering where we came from and finding ways to honor that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Thank you for that question, Andrew.
So speaking of the future, something else that TanyaMarck and I are visioning and dreaming up, since this is our end of the year podcast episode, is for 2024, we want to start offering queer integration circles online. So supporting queer folks who have had some kind of altered space, altered consciousness experience, whether that be through some kind of medicine or breath work or meditation or yoga practice or some other practice. Because TanyaMarck and I both have our own different ways of having worked with people through those processes and practices. I've done a lot of trance work with people through hypnotherapy or shamanic journeying without the use of plants, and as well as dream work. And so integration circles and practices can be really helpful for people to make the most out of those experiences. And TanyaMarck, do you want to say a little bit more about where you come from with that?
Yeah, so I not only do I identify as a person in recovery since 1989, I also identify as a medicine person. And so I do have both personal work with plant medicines and psychedelic medicines and earth medicines, where I've worked with teachers and shamans for my own personal journey, and I've also been called to be of service to others. So I hold space for those that are in altered states, whether it's through breath work, working with plant medicines. That does not necessarily mean imbibing with the medicine. It could be working spiritually with the medicine. So my practice, Vominos, is a harm reduction and care practice. So I hold space in a variety of ways, through individual work and through group work. for folks. So Nick and I talked about the importance of integration, meaning how do you take the experiences that you have in working with breath work or meditation or plant medicines? How do you take what has been given from that and how do you work with it in the future, and how do you develop a toolkit or refine a toolkit to allow you to support what downloads you might have been given through your experiences. And we recognize the need for queer spaces in that regard so that folks, let's be honest, as queer people, when we go into other spaces, we do have to do a lot to prepare ourselves to, fit into those spaces. So a queer integration space is literally no need to do all of that background context shit. Come as you are and share about your experience and be seen and held and supported in that way. So yeah, it's exciting to me to think about, expanding my community service work in that way. I have a Fourth Sundays that I work with a dear Charlotte James, and I co-facilitate Fourth Sundays, which is a BIPOC psychedelic care circle. And that's been happening since early 2020. And so that's Fourth Sundays. And as I continue to do that, I recognize the need for that in our queer community too. So when I came to you and said, hey, it just all synced up that you're like, oh, I'm also, thinking of a way to be of service. So I think it's exciting to think about what that might look like and how we might share that, in this upcoming year with our community.
Yeah. Because as, psychedelic medicine is coming forward, more and more people are interested in using it for healing, both above ground and underground. I've done some trainings and practices with that with different teachers over the last few years with my shamanic counseling and hypnotherapy teacher, Isa Gucciardi, at the Foundation of the Sacred Stream, and with Hannah McLean at Sound Mind in Philadelphia. And I'm about to do another training on ketamine work with Polaris here in San Francisco. And so just getting more and more training to support people, because people were coming into my practice, and you were probably experiencing this too, TanyaMarck, where people would go to circles and have these experiences, but then either because of their identity and what, being a person of color or queer, or just the lack of holding or skillfulness that maybe the person had, or their intention didn't create space or the opportunity to continue to integrate after the experience. And so we want to offer space for queer folks to come into community, and also just hearing other people's stories can really help you integrate your own process and know that what you experience is not, it may have felt strange or confusing or scary, but that other people have similar kinds of experiences. And together, by sharing that, we can learn to interpret and unpack and find a way for you to best use whatever wisdom or medicine or healing that came through your experience to support you moving forward.
Absolutely, 100. And because we are care-centric, I feel very comfortable naming that community service work has always been a part of my toolkit since I was 11 years old. And I've spent the last 18 months and continue to spend time as a peer supporter for Fireside Project, which is a psychedelic peer support line that is open 11 a.m. to 11 p.m. PST, 7 days a week, where if you are actively tripping or want to process a prior trip, you can call or text 62-FIRESIDE. So once a week, I hold space for active trippers or folks that want to process a prior trip that they've worked with medicine. As a person in recovery, I find it really important to hold space in this way for folks, because I know for a fact there are groups now, such as Psychedelics in Recovery, that support the fact that there are people who have been called that identify as people of recovery that are interested in exploring, right, plant medicines and psychedelic medicines and earth medicines with intentions that are, deep healing intentions, right, or introspective intentions. So I feel like the lens that I bring is really important, right, in that aspect, and that, there's a need there. So we are definitely going to explore how to bring something virtual and share that with you all, because it's super, super important.
Yeah, so look for that in the new year in 2024.
And I might as well say it. If there's any listener out there that would like to fund our queer integration circle, Nick and I would be super gracious. Like, this is my thing. Moving forward, I'm going to continue to ask and put it out there to our listeners and to our community that we would love to have this work funded so that it's all about equal energy exchange. So if you're interested, the link on how to do that will be in the show notes.
Well, as two Geminis, we could probably sit here and talk all day, but I think we could start winding down.
Yeah, that means we get to hear your buttery voice for a closing.
So for our listeners, as we ground in the beginning, we also do some kind of grounding out for the closing as well. So what should we do? We didn't talk about what we were going to do at the end.
Because I believe your wording was let spirit, we'll just let spirit. So let's just let spirit decide what feels good from our time together. And thank you. I want to thank the listeners, but I also want to thank Nick here on the show. Thank you for taking a leap of faith with me. And, our cultivated connection means so much. And while we don't say it often, just know that I love you. Pluto and I love you very much. So.
Aw. Pluto is TanyaMarck's pup. Housemate pup.
Yes. Soulmate, medicine dog. Pluto's so magical.
Yeah. Well, thank you for receiving the offering and coming in and joining me on this journey. So you brought a new energy to help me keep it going. So, yeah. Well, why don't we just end with a breath and a tone? How does that sound?
Sounds amazing.
So just coming back to our bodies, feeling our bodies supported by the earth, and thanking all of our native lands who supported and cultivated this earth before we were here where we are, and all of our queer spirit ancestors and community, our tools and practices, our guides, and anything else I'm forgetting to naming right now. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm just taking a deep breath in through the nose. And then closing with maybe just a simple Om to round everything out. So taking a breath in. Om. All right, everyone. Thank you for listening, and we'll be with you next time.
We'll see you at a first Saturday or in a podcast or a circle. Much love.
Resources that we shared today can be found in our show notes and at thequeerspirit.com.
You're invited to follow our show on Apple Podcasts or subscribe on your favorite podcast platform.
Thanks for listening.
Until next time, much love and blessings. Aho.